My dear listeners, tonight I will take you on a journey through the dark corridors of time to the most ominous days in history. As you listen to the crackling fire, I sense a deep silence. For the story I'm about to tell is neither an ordinary tale nor a simple legend. This is the story of a disaster that darkened the lives of millions, brought civilizations to their knees, and led empires to ruin the Black Death. It all began unexpectedly in the windswept steppes of Central Asia. It was such a disease that no one initially understood what it was. People were horrified when they encountered its ominous symptoms: black spots appearing on their skin, sudden fevers, unbearable pain, and the inevitable shadow of death that came with these symptoms. At this point, the beliefs and fears of the people of that time became entangled. Was it a curse? Was it the wrath of the gods? Or was it the work of evil spirits? No one knew. But one thing was clear: death was at the door, and everyone could hear its footsteps. Soon after, the terrifying face of the Black Death spread from Central Asia to the west, all the way to the heart of Europe. Now imagine people waiting in the narrow streets of a village in eerie silence. They are trembling with fear, for there is no safe place left. Among the crumbling walls, the plague roams like a shadow in a dark cloak. People lock their doors, afraid to even look outside the windows. No one wants to leave their homes, because the plague is everywhere, like a killer waiting on the doorstep. This is how the terrifying story of the Black Death begins. But this is just the beginning. This disease was not only a physical torment to individuals, but also a calamity that corroded the souls of societies, brought empires to their knees, and shook beliefs and values. Today I will tell you how the Black Death left its mark on history, how it took over cities and villages, and how it changed humanity. Are you ready? Then let's embark on this challenging journey together. Now, with this silent crowd gathered around the fire, let's begin to turn the dusty pages of history. We'll experience this terrifying adventure from the origins of the Black Death in the steppes of Central Asia to its impact on the heart of Europe. We will journey from the deepest darkness to the light, from fear to hope. And so we begin. Dear friends, tonight I'm taking you once more through the dark corridors of history, to those unforgettable and terrifying moments. At the center of this story is one of humanity's greatest and most frightening empires, the Mongol Empire. An empire that shook all of Asia with the hooves of its horses and etched its name into history with its boundless conquests. Yet, it also became a carrier of another terrifying force, the Black Death. Many historians and scholars debate the exact origins of the Black Death. Some theories suggest it began in the depths of Central Asia, in the vast lands of the Mongol Empire, among the expansive steppes and the mountains hiding dark secrets. This deadly disease emerged silently. The Mongol lands were surrounded by the gleam of warriors' armor and swords on one side, and the dark shadow of the disease on the other. The Mongol Empire's territories stretched from the heart of Asia to the edges of Europe. The vast network established by the Mongols was like a spider's web, spreading in all directions. However, this network became a route not only for trade, cultures, and information, but also for death. As the Mongol armies carried the flames of war and conquest, they unknowingly transported the seeds of the Black Death. While the Mongols secured trade routes, bringing prosperity and wealth, they also facilitated the rapid spread of a deadly epidemic. The Mongol armies could travel from one place to another in weeks, but the disease, carried by fleas and rats, spread with the speed of a storm. The plague's traces were already visible in the vast steppes extending from Karakoram to modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Legends and historians tell of this terrifying plague advancing from the heart of Central Asia, particularly along the Silk Road. In the 1340s, the first signs of the Black Death were recorded around Issyk Kul Lake in present-day Kyrgyzstan. It is said that the people here faced sudden and painful deaths. Villages and towns were abandoned in an instant, with doors and windows left wide open, as those fleeing had no intention of returning. These lands slowly bowed to the silent rule of death. The Black Death took its first steps here, at the borders of the Mongol Empire. Mongol leaders, especially the descendants of Genghis Khan, were unsure of how to handle this new and unknown enemy. Their armies, victorious and powerful in countless battles before, faced an invisible foe this time. No wall or armor could protect them from this enemy. The plague was not only seizing people's bodies but also their souls. The disease carried by Mongol soldiers quickly spread through their own cities and then throughout the region. As Mongol armies advanced west from what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, they unknowingly carried the deadly burden of the Black Death. Each city, fortress, and town rapidly conquered by the Mongol Empire became not only a battlefield but also a cemetery where the plague thrived. This deadly disease began to drift like a dark cloud over the Mongol Empire and all the lands it had conquered. And so this is how the journey of the Black Death began, dear friends. On one side, the Mongol army's conquest campaigns, on the other, the shadows of an invisible enemy, the Black Death. This story is not only about a disease but also about fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. Under the splendor of the Mongol Empire, the steps of that invisible enemy grew louder and stronger. And this was just the beginning. The Black Death would move far beyond Mongol lands, advancing to the heart of the entire world. Now, dear friends, I will take you to the misty streets, bustling markets, and cobblestone alleys of that era. When I close my eyes and take a deep breath, I remember the days when the first news spread like a dark wind across the world. Yes, a dark wind. Because the Black Death approached insidiously, stealthily, like a shadow that no one had yet noticed. The first reports of the outbreak started coming from very far away, from the heart of Central Asia. In the vast lands of the Mongol Empire, in small villages, traders' rest stops, and the courtyards of inns and caravanserais, people began to fall one by one. Some were burning with high fevers, while others writhed in pain from the dreadful black pustules appearing beneath their skin. As silence fell over one village, the same scene was being played out days later in another. No one fully understood what was happening. Was it a curse? Had the gods become angry? At that time, no one knew that this incomprehensible outbreak was carried by tiny but deadly creatures. The rats and their tiny but dangerous companions, the fleas. Yes, these two small entities were the loyal harbingers of the Black Death. Rats, especially the black and furry ones, were moving toward crowded cities, ports, and towns, carrying these deadly passengers on their backs. Imagine, dear friends, the movement of the rats was like the flow of a river. Wherever the water went, the rats followed, leaving death in their wake. The black rats first appeared in some port cities. As merchants transported their goods by ship, the rats stealthily infiltrated these vessels. A pair of rats settling on a handful of grain in a ship's hold were unknowingly sowing the seeds of a disaster that would devastate all the coastal towns, unbeknownst to anyone. With their tiny feet, they were carrying perhaps the greatest nightmare in history. One day, a ship approaching the morning market in the trade city of Kaffa in Crimea was observed. When the ship docked at the port, something strange was noticed. Most of the crew had died, and the remaining ones were suffering from a deep fever. As the city dwellers stared in astonishment at this strange ship, rats began to disembark one by one. The port officials quickly quarantined the ship, but it was too late. The rats and fleas had already spread from the ship to the city, becoming the harbingers of the Black Death. Especially those fleas, tiny yet powerful creatures. The fleas, carrying disease-causing microbes on their fur, transferred the disease to humans and other animals. As fleas sucked the blood of rats, they also contracted the deadly disease themselves. When rats arrived in a new area, the fleas jumped to new hosts, leaving their deadly load with humans. A flea bite might last only a few minutes, but the ensuing death could be a nightmare lasting weeks. Inside these fleas was the microscopic soldier of the Black Death, the bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. Although the first cases appeared isolated in small villages, the outbreak quickly spread to towns and then to cities. People were falling ill and dying with an incomprehensible speed. Especially those living in coastal towns would wake up one morning to find half their neighborhoods empty. No one knew where the disease came from or how it spread. They only fled. But where to? The rats were everywhere. The Black Death moved step by step, leaving death and fear in its wake. Some people realized that rats and fleas were the source of the disease, but in many places these creatures were so widespread and common that no one had the power to stop them. Hiding behind city walls was not enough to escape the rats and fleas. Those tiny harbingers could infiltrate everywhere, find every crack, and reach every corner where you tried to hide. Yes, dear friends, this is how the first days of the Black Death began. Under the shadow of rats, fleas, and an invisible death, people were helpless and didn't know what to do. Some prayed to the gods while others searched in fear for a glimmer of hope. But alas, that glimmer of hope would not appear for a long time. The Black Death was still at the beginning of its journey and had many more places to conquer and lives to claim. Ah, yes, friends, here's another harrowing tale I want to share with you. An unforgettable chapter in the spread of the Black Death. A story of dark days, ruthless plans, and the finely woven moments of fate. The Mongols, masters of war and conquest, had already secured their place in history. However, perhaps no war was more terrifying than the way the Black Death was used as a weapon in their hands. At that time, the Mongols and the Genoese stood on the brink of trade and warfare at those strategic points on the Black Sea. The city of Kaffa, present-day Feodosia, was seen by the Mongols as a key gateway to the west, the heart of trade routes. But the Genoese were doing everything in their power to keep this crucial port in their hands. The Mongol army, with great fury and ambition, laid siege to this port city. Days, weeks, and months passed. Food dwindled behind the city walls, and hopes were fading. But things weren't going well outside either. Among the Mongol troops, a sneaky and invisible enemy was preparing for its own battle. The disease had infiltrated the army insidiously. The Mongols began to fall ill and die one by one. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. Perhaps they feared their enemy's sorcery or the wrath of the gods. But it wasn't long before they realized the speed and impact of the disease's spread. And at that moment, a dark idea came to their minds: to use the Black Death as a weapon of war. At this point, dear friends, the Mongol military genius turned the disease into a strategy against the Genoese. They might not have been able to defeat their enemies, but they could instill fear and disease among them. The Mongols loaded the bodies of soldiers who had died from the plague into large catapults. These heavy, decaying bodies were hurled like giant stones at Kaffa's walls. Imagine waking up one morning to find dead bodies raining down from the sky. As the city folk watched in shock and horror at the Mongol army's new weapon, chaos began to erupt in the city. These corpses were not just a threat of war, but also the embodiment of death and disease. The Genoese were terrified by this deadly threat. They tried to burn the bodies, push them away from the walls. But it was too late. The Black Death had already entered the city. Fleas, having separated from the corpses, began to spread within the walls and throughout the city. The disease quickly spread among traders, soldiers, and even the city's leading figures. The Genoese fell ill, running in panic, with everyone in the city thinking one thing: how do we escape this death trap? This is where the trading ships came into play. The Genoese quickly boarded ships to escape from the infected Kaffa. Believing they could escape the horrific face of the Black Death, they set sail for Europe. But there was something they didn't know: the Black Death had boarded the ships with them. Rats and fleas had infiltrated every corner of the wooden ships, between the planks, in the holds, and in the sleeping quarters. The confined spaces of the ships were an ideal environment for the disease to spread. As the ships rocked on the waves, the disease was rapidly circulating through the crew and passengers. Days later, some of these ships docked at the ports of Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Dock workers, merchants, and city folk saw strange spots and swellings on the bodies of those disembarking from the ships. It wasn't long before these spots began appearing on the skin of the city's residents as well. The Black Death had set foot in Europe, and this was just the beginning. Yes, dear friends, the Black Death, with the Mongols' war strategy, unexpectedly made its way into the heart of Europe. What began as a weapon of war quickly turned into a catastrophe that would engulf an entire continent. And think about it, just a few corpses would cost thousands, even millions of lives. Now you understand better how the Black Death knocked on the door of the Europeans and stepped through it, right? But this is just the beginning of a long story. Kaffa. When thinking about those dark days, we can't skip mentioning that port city now known as Feodosia. On the Crimean Peninsula today, surrounded by the waves of the Black Sea, this small city once witnessed one of history's most unforgettable moments. And it was a moment that changed the course of history, rewriting humanity's destiny. Back then, Kaffa was a significant trading hub, a port where you could find everything from valuable spices and silks to precious stones and exotic animals. The aroma of this wealth was felt not just in the salty sea breeze, but also in the conversations of traders from distant lands. The Genoese had built it as a colony and tightly held onto this strategic spot. But the Mongols, the Mongols. To them, Kaffa was not just a port but a grand gateway to the west. It was the key to trade routes and new lands to conquer. Mongol leader Kani Bek was a daring and ambitious warrior. He wanted to capture Kaffa, showcase his power to the west, and completely seize control of the trade routes. Thus, the Mongol army arrived in force and laid siege to the city. The siege began. Days turned into weeks, and the Mongols tried every method to capture the city. They hurled stones with catapults, launched arrow storms, and attempted to breach the walls. But the Genoese did not falter. They continued to resist behind their fortifications. But friends, war is not just about armies clashing. Sometimes fate hands you an unexpected weapon. And so, during those days, a dark fate allied with the Mongols. An invisible enemy, deadly, ruthless, and terrifying, was roaming the Mongol camp. The Black Death had insidiously entered the Mongol ranks. At night, cries were heard from the soldiers' tents, bodies weakened, and faces turned pale as chalk. The disease spread rapidly. When Kani Bek realized his army was melting away before his eyes, he understood that he might lose not only Kaffa but also his own soldiers. And at this point, perhaps the first biological war in history began. Realizing he couldn't defeat the disease, Kani Bek made a decision. An unprecedented, unheard-of decision. He would use the deadly disease spreading through his army as a weapon against his enemies. The Mongols loaded the bodies of soldiers who had died from the plague into large catapults. These corpses, like machines of death, were hurled over the walls into Kaffa. Imagine waking up one morning to see death raining from the sky. The Genoese were stunned by this horrifying strategy. The corpses crashed against the walls, falling and breaking apart. The city turned into a nightmare. The smell from the diseased bodies slowly seeped into the narrow streets, homes, and marketplaces. Fear and panic spread rapidly among the people. The disease from the corpses quickly enveloped the city. People were bewildered, unsure of what to do in the face of both the plague and the Mongols' threat. In Kaffa, everyone was searching for different ways to escape this curse. Some prayed, others performed rituals on the city walls. However, the Black Death had such power that no prayer, no spell, no medicine could stand against it. Death began to claim lives one by one. The Genoese realized that their only option was to leave the city to escape the dark calamity. They boarded the waiting trading ships, leaving everything behind. But as they fled, they failed to notice something: the plague had boarded the ships with them. Rats and fleas. Yes, friends, the faithful servants of the Black Death. These tiny creatures would hide in the wooden hulls of the ships, among the cargo, and carry the plague to the heart of Europe. And so, the first step of the biological war that began in Kaffa would continue with the spread of the Black Death throughout Europe. The siege of Kaffa and the beginning of biological warfare became more than just a battle outcome. They were events that changed the flow of world history. That brave and ruthless Mongol army unknowingly became the carrier of one of the greatest pandemics in human history. And thus, dear friends, the Black Death knocked on Europe's doors. But this was just the beginning, because this disease would burn and destroy everything in its path, like a dark storm. All right, listen up, friends. Now, let me take you along the warm waters of the Mediterranean to perhaps the most grim port in history, the famous Messina harbor in Sicily. The year was 1347, and dark clouds were gathering not just in the sky but in people's hearts as well. Yet no one, neither in Messina nor elsewhere, had any idea of the great disaster approaching. That fall, one early morning, the guards at Messina harbor saw something in the sea. From a distance, a fleet of ships was approaching the horizon. These ships belonged to Genoese traders, but this time there were no cheerful shouts or signs of eagerly awaited cargo. No, these ships seemed to be cloaked in a deathly silence. As they neared the harbor, the empty decks of the ships became apparent, and a strange odor carried by the wind reached the shore. At that moment, no one there knew that the first seeds of the plague had just touched European soil. Messina harbor had long been one of the Mediterranean's busiest trade hubs. Silks, spices, precious stones, and countless goods from rivers and oceans passed through here. But that morning, Messina's fate was about to change. As the ships docked, port officials approached them. However, with each step they took toward the ships, a horrendous smell hit their faces, stopping them in their tracks. They felt that something was terribly wrong. The ships appeared empty, but they were silently filled with death. When they boarded the ships, the scene was horrifying. Corpses. There were bodies everywhere. Some were piled in corners. Others leaned against the masts. The dead had expressions of fear and pain, their skin darkened, bruised, and swollen. But the corpses were just the beginning. The still living crew members were half alive, burning with fever and moaning deliriously. Their eyes were vacant and dark. Many were on the brink of death. The port officials recoiled. They struggled to grasp what was happening. Like debris washed ashore after a storm, the plague's disaster had also reached the shore with the ships. But people are curious, my friends. Sometimes curiosity is like a lifeline. The port authorities decided to investigate the ships more closely to find out what was happening. Eyes, ears, every sense was on alert. And at that moment, as some crew members felt death's cold breath, Messina's story was veering in a new direction. As the surviving sailors descended to the port in terror and agony, the plague's dreadful, invisible claws had already wrapped around them. The plague's carriers, those tiny, deadly rats and fleas, began to spread rapidly from the ships to the streets of Messina. They slunk through the narrow alleys and dark corners of the port town. Rats and fleas hopping off the ships and onto the wooden docks. They were the true messengers of this Black Death. And sadly, no one noticed their presence. The rats slipped from beneath wooden floors and into the depths of cellars, creeping through cracks in homes, vanishing into the darkness. Their tiny footsteps were almost inaudible in the silence of the night. But those silent steps were starting the dance of death. In the first few days, people living around the harbor began to notice a strange disease spreading. But no one understood what this illness was. The initial symptoms were mild, perhaps a fever, perhaps weakness. But soon the symptoms worsened. The fever soared, people groaned, and black spots and pus-filled blisters appeared on their skin. These blisters were the symbols of the Black Death, the buboes, painful, inflamed swellings of the lymph nodes that were the nightmares of the people. As the nights progressed, Messina's narrow, winding streets began to smell of death. The screams rising from the houses blended with the dark streets. The city's monks and priests tried to help people by praying, but no one could stop this dreadful disease. The illness spread rapidly, and everyone in the city began to fall, one by one. Doors were knocked on to check if the occupants inside were alive or dead, but often there was no response from within. People tried to understand the origins of this Black Death. Where had this disease come from? How was it spreading so quickly? Yet the answer was not far off. Rats, fleas, and sick sailors disembarking from the trading ships. These were the harbingers of the plague. The plague had created a wave of fear and helplessness that consumed not just bodies but souls as well. In their desperation, people began to beg their gods, kneeling before sacred figures. But this was just the beginning. The Black Death, as it left Messina, had ignited the fuse for a much greater catastrophe. This deadly disease, carried by trading ships along trade routes, quickly spread to other cities in Italy. Venice, Genoa, Florence. No place was safe. Wherever it touched, whatever city it visited, death followed. Europe was being introduced to a fear it had never known before. This outbreak moved like a hurricane across the continent. Within just a few weeks of the first case in Messina, it jumped to Italy's major cities. Port cities, being the starting points of Europe's extensive trade networks, were the initial hotspots. Every ship, every trader had become a carrier of the plague. As people desperately tried to flee, the disease spread even faster. Until then, no one had a clear understanding of the true cause of the disease. Some believed it was God's wrath, a punishment for sins, immorality. Others blamed the positions of the stars, believing the signs in the sky had foretold this disaster. But the real cause was a microscopic enemy, silently landing at Messina harbor and spreading through the city throughout the night, the rats and fleas carrying the plague. Thus, this deadly disease that changed Europe's fate had stepped onto the continent at Messina harbor in Sicily. And that first step marked the beginning of one of history's greatest catastrophes. As the Black Death spread across Europe, it unveiled a horror that would deeply affect the lives of kings, peasants, traders, priests, and everyone. Now listen, friends, how did this disease spread across Europe? What paths did it follow? And who were its victims? We will delve even deeper into that story. Now let me tell you how the Black Death spread its wings deeper and further into Europe. The Black Plague, as soon as it stepped onto European soil from the port of Messina in Sicily, began its hunt for new victims like a hungry wolf. The first stops of this disease were the bustling, crowded cities of southern Europe. Marseille, the jewel of southern France, one of the most important trading ports of the Mediterranean. Marseille, how lively and colorful it was back then. Its arches, wide squares, wine-scented streets. But the Black Plague came to this beautiful city one night, like a sneaky thief. A ship that had fled from Messina, hoping to escape the disease by setting sail, headed for the port of Marseille. The people on the ship wanted to leave the disease behind, but little did they know they were actually bringing it with them. As soon as the ship docked, the first cases appeared in the city. At first it was just a few merchants, a few sailors, but soon the disease spread to markets, churches, homes, and streets. The Black Death began to seep into every corner of Marseille, turning those lively streets into silence. And then Genoa. Ah, the magnificent port of Genoa. In northern Italy, the gateway to the Mediterranean. This wealthy port city, where the heart of trade beat and goods and money changed hands. Genoa may have been one of the cities hit hardest by the plague. Genoese merchants traveled across the Mediterranean, buying and selling all kinds of goods. But who could have known that these merchants were carrying death along with their goods? Ships docking in Genoa brought not just traders but also the deadly disease. Rats jumped from the ship's hold to the port, fleas infected people, and the disease spread rapidly. At first it was the dock workers, then the vendors at the market, and soon the city's population. Genoa's streets quickly filled with closed shops, rising moans, and carts carrying the dead. From Genoa to Venice. Venice, which was known as the Queen of the Seas at the time. Gondolas gliding through its canals, stone bridges, narrow streets. But unfortunately, the Black Death also knocked on Venice's door. Merchants fleeing from Genoa arrived in Venice by sea. Thus, the plague entered Venice's famous canals. Death quietly waited behind one of the gondolas gliding on the water. The plague spread so quickly in Venice that it reached every corner of the city in no time. People began to think the disease was spreading through the water. Some believed the mist rising from the canals brought death. But the reality was even scarier. The plague was everywhere, both on the water and on land. Even if a plague victim died, the fleas that left the body quickly spread to find new victims. From there to Barcelona. That beautiful city on Spain's Mediterranean coast, that vibrant port. The plague reached Barcelona quickly as well. The disease swept through the streets of Barcelona like a hurricane. People fled in fear, desperately trying to escape. But the streets of Barcelona were narrow and crowded. There was no place to run. The plague was claiming lives all around the city. Neither the rich nor the poor could escape this Black Death. Servants in wealthy mansions, priests in churches, beggars in the streets. Everyone shared the same fate. And other port cities. Montpellier, Valencia, Palma, Naples. The Black Death had reached the gates of all these cities along the Mediterranean. The ports were filled with ships carrying the disease. Each port became a new gateway, a new hunting ground for the plague. The plague clung to Europe's southern shores and quickly moved west and north. Ah, who could escape the ruthless hand of the Black Death? In every one of these cities, people cried out to God, desperately begging for help. But the Black Death paid no attention to prayers or pleas. It was like a ghost, making its presence felt with every gust of wind, every ship that docked, every trade route. As Europe trembled in the face of this horror, the plague had not yet said its final word. Listen, my friends, to how the Black Plague spread throughout Europe and changed the course of history. What I will tell you next will draw you even deeper, as the horror of the Black Death is just beginning. Ah, dear friends, the Black Death quickly spread north from the southern ports of Europe. Like a raging river overcoming every obstacle in its path, it left the shadow of death in every city and town it passed through. Now, let me take you to those great cities: London, Paris, Rome. The ancient cities where people's hopes and dreams thrived among the bustling crowds. After London, Paris, Rome, and other major cities, the Black Death rapidly spread further into Europe, moving north and east. The plague moved like an invisible enemy among people, touching each one individually. But the epidemic was not just destroying bodies, it was also tearing apart the fabric of societies. As cities emptied, Europe's crowded streets, marketplaces, and the laughter-filled alleys suddenly fell silent. People's hopes and dreams faded away one by one. Let's continue tracing the path of this Black Death together. As it moved into the heart of Europe, the plague affected everything from the small towns at the foot of the Alps to the great cities along the banks of the Rhine River. In Central Europe, along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Germany, the plague spread rapidly through towns and villages. Even the trade hubs along the Rhine, like Mainz, Frankfurt, and Cologne, couldn't escape this Black Death. Rivers and trade routes had become channels not just for goods but also for death. A merchant arriving by caravan, a priest traveling from village to village, brought not holy books but seeds of the Black Death. As the Black Death moved north, it reached the windy shores of the Netherlands and the flower fields of Belgium. Flemish cities like Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, all were covered by this dark cloud. Trade halted, ports were engulfed in silence. The Dutch, like other Europeans, didn't know what to do. People abandoned their homes, left their farms, and desperately tried to flee to other places. But there was no escaping the Black Death. Winds, rivers, roads, everything carried it further away. As we moved towards Eastern Europe, villages and fortresses in Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia also fell into the ruthless arms of this deadly disease. Cities like Krakow and Warsaw in Poland, Prague in Bohemia, Buda in Hungary, and many more. Each was under the same fear and horror. People prayed in churches, but death ignored their pleas. In Russia, the situation was different. Major cities like Moscow and Novgorod were more isolated compared to other European regions. Yet the plague still found its way east. In Moscow, the bells tolled every day like harbingers of death. People locked themselves indoors, fearfully avoiding the outside world. However, the plague began to rule even in the heart of Moscow. Although Russia's vast steppes and endless forests slightly delayed the spread of the epidemic, the Black Death still overcame all obstacles. The cold northern lands were not an insurmountable challenge for the plague. The Black Death left devastating impacts across every corner of Europe. A significant portion of the population perished, cities emptied, fields were left untended, and harvests were not collected. Trade, art, science, all remained in the shadow of this great disaster. But dear friends, despite all this destruction, the human spirit incredibly continued to resist. People, even in despair, sought ways to find life. Some strengthened their faith, some interpreted the situation as punishment and sought ways to atone for their sins. Others fell into complete despair, believing they would never recover. Yet wisdom has always sought a glimmer of hope amid dark clouds throughout history. This Black Death would eventually come to an end, heralding the dawn of a new era. People would develop new methods for survival, cities would fill up again, and life would blossom anew. The Black Death would be remembered as an unforgettable turning point in history, but it was not just an end, it was also a new beginning. Ah, my friends. As the terrifying face of the Black Death ravaged Europe, it left deep marks on the souls of its people. In their quest for the cause, source, and cure of this dreadful disease, people turned their faces to the heavens and their hearts to God. The epidemic not only challenged the body but also forced a profound spiritual reckoning. What could be the cause of such a great disaster? Was this catastrophe a divine wrath from God or a test for humanity? During such times, a group of people began to appear in the streets, walking barefoot with their clothes drenched in blood and whipping themselves with long lashes. These were known as flagellants or whippers in our language. Bearing signs of both suffering and deep devotion on their faces, they traveled from city to city, town to town. Their red and white garments, the crosses draped over their shoulders, and the religious symbols embroidered on their chests drew attention. Each step raised dust, and with every lash the sharp sound reverberated through the air, leaving the crowd with a mixture of fear and awe. The flagellants believed that the plague was a punishment from God. They thought they needed to punish themselves to appease God's wrath. To atone for the sins of humanity and calm God's anger, they scourged and bruised their own bodies, attempting to purify their wounded souls. According to their belief, this pain would enforce divine justice and save people from death. Every day at dawn they gathered in groups and knelt. Led by a priest or a leader, they sang hymns and said prayers. Then, when everyone had knelt and bowed their heads, the leader would draw out his whip and deliver the first blow. Each lash was a step towards purifying both the spirit and the body. People were drenched in blood and sweat, but there was a sacred light in their eyes and a deep sense of peace on their faces. "May God forgive us," they cried out. "God's wrath will subside and death will retreat." The flagellant rituals often sparked a kind of religious fervor or spiritual excitement among the people. They came to watch this devoted group, hoping to share in God's forgiveness. Some were terrified, while others felt profound admiration for their devotion. In the streets, squares, and churches, the prayers and hymns of these whip-wielding crowds echoed. As people watched this unusual group, they also faced their own inner struggles. Everyone remembered their own sins and sought hope for atonement. But, dear friends, the flagellant movement was not just an attempt at purification. It was also an expression of rebellion and resistance. It was a manifestation of anger against the church, the clergy, and sometimes even God. The church seemed powerless against the plague. Priests, holy water, and prayers could not stop its advance. People began to lose faith in the church's weak and helpless stance. Therefore, the flagellants sometimes challenged the church's authority, silencing priests and elevating their own rituals and prayers. There were times when cities became stages for these whipping displays. People flocked to watch these intriguing ceremonies, perhaps hoping to find hope or healing. However, over time, the church began to see the flagellants as heretics. They became a threat in the church's eyes. There was fear that this extreme religious fervor might create unrest in society. The church started to suppress the movement, arresting and even executing its leaders. Yet, no matter what they did, it was not easy to overcome the fear and belief that had already taken root in people's hearts. Dear friends, the Black Death was not just a disease, but also a great test of people's spirit and faith. When faced with such a colossal disaster, people, as always, sought meaning. The flagellants were part of this search. Their whips were not only a call to cleanse their bodies, but also to awaken the spirit of society. Cleanse your sins, purify your heart, and perhaps God's mercy will shine upon you again. But sadly, my friends, these movements could not halt the advance of the Black Death. People continued to face their own helplessness between prayers and lashes. The hopeful voices of the flagellants faded into the somber echoes of the plague. Yet each cry, each prayer left a mark in the depths of history. People's faith, hopes, and fears were once again tested in the shadow of the Black Death. My friends, when the shadow of the Black Death fell over Europe, it didn't just shroud the bodies but also the minds and hearts of people in darkness. The fear of death, helplessness, and uncertainty drove people into such deep despair that everyone began searching for a scapegoat. During that time, the easiest solution for people was to find someone to blame behind the invisible enemy. Sadly, the targets of these accusations were the Jews and other minority groups. Imagine, dear listeners, as the plague spread as swiftly as the winds through the streets, and death visited homes and never left, people desperately prayed to God, but there was no answer. Neither prayers nor the church's sacred rituals seemed to work. With the church itself bowing to God's silence, people sought another way in their minds, a scapegoat. And at this point, a tragic misunderstanding, a wave of ignorance and fear, took center stage in history. People of that time were mostly caught in the claws of ignorance and prejudice. As they tried to understand the cause of the Black Death, they turned their eyes to their neighbors. The Jews, with their different religions, traditions, and lifestyles, had always stood out as a distinct community. They were often seen as foreign, strange, and incomprehensible in the eyes of the Christian majority. Additionally, Jews usually lived in their own neighborhoods, engaged in trade, and practiced their rituals secretly. This separation became even more pronounced during the Plague Days, making them appear as potential culprits in the eyes of the people. The first rumors suggested that the Jews had started the plague by poisoning wells. How? According to the Dark Street gossip, Jews were supposedly sneaking to wells at night, performing magic, scattering poisonous powders, and then disappearing. It didn't take long for people to believe these fictional tales, as they were desperately seeking explanations. Why had this dreadful disease suddenly emerged and ravaged them? They needed an explanation. They needed a culprit. As you might guess, these rumors spread rapidly. From churches to marketplaces, from homes to taverns, such gossip circulated everywhere. People began whispering to each other, the Jews did it, and thus began one of the darkest and most brutal chapters in history. The accusations fueled the public's rage, and that rage soon turned into pogroms. In Germany, France, Italy, cities across Europe began targeting Jews. Pogroms, or mass killings, were a manifestation of the public's hatred, setting fire to Jewish neighborhoods and slaughtering women, children, and the elderly without distinction. This wave of violence reached a point where Jewish communities had to flee from their cities. Many Jews left their homes, businesses, and lives in search of safer places. But wherever they went, they faced the same accusations and threats. Dear friends, not only Jews but also those accused of witchcraft, labeled as heretics, and those with different beliefs or lifestyles became targets of this wave of hatred. People expressed their fears and helplessness through violence, and distrust grew between individuals. Brothers became enemies, neighbors turned into killers. For Jewish communities, this period was not only a physical devastation but also a spiritual trial. Imagine finding yourself at the center of a collective hatred, trying to protect your life, beliefs, and loved ones while enduring one of history's darkest moments. Even as they fled these pogroms, the Jews did not lose hope. For them it meant a new migration, a new struggle. Some found acceptance in new settlements, while others faced the harsh injustices of history. But my friends, the most tragic part was that all these massacres, accusations, and violence did nothing to stop the spread of the Black Death. No matter which well they thought they had poisoned or which culprit they punished, death continued to spread. The Black Death struck everyone equally, from cities to villages, from homes to palaces. Rich or poor, young or old, it made no distinctions. In the end, my friends, people had to realize once again that neither the Jews nor other minority groups were responsible for this tragedy. But this realization came too late. Europe entered a period where not only bodies but also souls were wounded. The scars left in people's hearts and minds would not heal easily. So, dear listeners, under the shadow of the Black Death, human history was shaped by both suffering and grief, as well as hope and resistance. But our story doesn't end here. Now let's take a look at the social and economic impacts of the plague and how people tried to rebuild a new order after this great devastation. Because every disaster brings with it a need for change and renewal. If you're ready, our story continues from where we left off. Dear friends, the terror of the Black Death rose from the sunny southern shores of Europe and, defying the cold and harsh winds of the north, extended all the way from the British Isles to the snowy peaks of Scandinavia. Even the remote and isolated lands of northern Europe were not spared from the fierce grip of the Black Death. At first, England's harbors and ports were silent. News of the plague came from France, Italy, and further south. The English and northern peoples believed that this disease would never reach their cold northern lands. They thought, we're safe here, but dear friends, The plague's winds were so strong that these beliefs were soon shattered. Plague ships emerging from the warm waters of the Mediterranean mixed into the cold waves of the English Channel. One of these ships, carrying one of history's greatest tragedies, docked in Weymouth Harbor on England's southern coast in 1348. Hidden among the traders and sailors, the disease quickly spread like a storm through the narrow streets and stone houses of the port. London. O London, the city of vast crowds, with its churches, palaces, marketplaces, and busy trade networks, became the perfect ground for the plague. As markets overflowed, and the city's smells enchanted the senses, the Black Death silently, but swiftly circulated among us. Everyone talked about the symptoms: sudden fevers, dreadful skin spots, suffocating coughs. This ominous disease, which began in London's narrow streets, soon spread to every corner of the kingdom. Even the royal palace could not escape this deadly threat. The city knelt under the weight of dead and sick bodies. The church bells rang incessantly at night. Every toll announced another death. But friends, the plague did not stop in London. The disease advanced from southern England to the north. It reached Scotland, and from there crossed the seas to Norway and Sweden. In Norway, as ships' sails fluttered in Bergen's winds, grim news arrived in these cold lands. Trade ships were now filled not with the bounties of trade, but with the cold breath of death. The ships that docked on Norway's shores now carried not passengers, but plague-infested rats and fleas. Norwegian fishermen were catching as many disease-carrying rats in their nets as fish. Every ship that anchored in Bergen harbor was like a death warrant. As for Sweden, oh dear listeners, Sweden was known even then for its cold and vast forests and remote villages. But the plague penetrated even the depths of the forests. It spread from Stockholm's crowded streets to the isolated rural villages. The wooden doors of village homes closed one by one, fields lay fallow, and animals were left unattended. Even the northern lights shining in the night sky could not illuminate this horrific scene. In these lands, the cries and wails of those caught by the disease were unheard. Only a cold, deadly silence prevailed. In Denmark. This small but powerful kingdom also fell victim to this dreadful disease. From Copenhagen to Aarhus, all major ports were seized by the Black Death. Danish sailors and traders initially believed that the disease was only an affliction of foreigners. But the plague soon visited them as well. Warehouses, palaces, and churches in the ports could not escape the effects of the disease. The kingdom faced a crisis unseen in centuries. In Scandinavia, the situation was even more tragic. Plague ships floated like ghosts on the northern waters. They were no longer trade ships but silent vessels of death. Trade came to a halt. Sails on the North Sea began to lower. Sailors feared approaching ports, as each new harbor could be a new stop for death. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Each fell one after another under the weight of the Black Death. Trade ceased, ports closed, towns and villages were engulfed in silence. Do you see, dear friends? In this tale where the Black Death even reached the cold northern lands, human history once again faced a dark trial. The people of these lands, while resisting the dark shadow of the plague, faced deep wounds from the halt in trade, the collapse of towns, and the silence of villages that would leave marks for centuries. But as every night has a dawn, this dark night too would eventually have a light. For the human spirit is always filled with a desire for renewal and rebirth. Now let's see how Europe changed after this dreadful epidemic and how new orders were established. If you're ready, let's continue the story. Ah, my friends. Now let's turn our eyes to the sunny southern lands, to the magnificent cities of Italy. As the plague ravaged all of Europe, people and rulers alike were asking a single question: how can we stop this catastrophe? It was here, in the wise and courageous cities of Italy, that the idea of quarantine was first conceived and implemented on the historical stage. Today we'll talk about Venice and Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, these two cities that bravely and intelligently faced these dark times.